At 9:43 on the morning of the 7th of April, 1943, Captain Robert Johnson crouched beside his B-17 Flying Fortress on Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, watching a formation of 18 Japanese Zero fighters approach at 12,000 feet. His bomber crew had been officially grounded 16 hours earlier by Major General Nathan Twining, who'd issued explicit orders that Johnson's aircraft was not to fly another combat mission until Johnson abandoned what Twining called dangerously reckless tactical modifications that violate every principle of bomber defense doctrine. Johnson had spent the previous 3 months proving that standard bomber defensive tactics got crews killed at predictable rates, and he developed a completely unauthorized gunnery methodology that transformed a flying fortress from a vulnerable target into a fighter-killing machine. His crew had shot down 47 Japanese fighters in 12 weeks, using techniques that officially didn't exist and weren't supposed to work. The 18 Zeros approaching Henderson Field represented either vindication or court-martial, because Johnson was about to disobey direct orders, take off in a grounded aircraft, and demonstrate that sometimes being right mattered more than being obedient, especially when obedience meant watching Japanese fighters slaughter American bomber crews who were following doctrine that didn't work. This moment mattered because the Army Air Forces had been losing bombers to Japanese fighters at unsustainable rates throughout the Pacific Campaign. The official defensive doctrine, tight formation flying with overlapping defensive fire, worked reasonably well in Europe against German fighters, but Japanese Zeros operated differently. They were more maneuverable, attacked from unexpected angles, and exploited the blind spots that existed in every bomber's defensive coverage, despite the overlapping fields of fire. The result was a grim statistical pattern. Bomber formations would engage Japanese fighters, shoot down a few attackers through sheer volume of defensive fire, but lose 2 to 4 bombers per mission to fighters that maneuvered into defensive gaps and killed crews before gunners could respond effectively. Johnson had proposed a radical solution 4 months earlier: abandon rigid formation doctrine, give individual gunners autonomous fire control authority, and train crews in predictive gunnery techniques that engaged fighters before they reached optimal attack positions rather than after they'd already committed to their runs. His approach required treating bomber gunners as offensive weapons rather than passive defenders, which contradicted every assumption embedded in AAF defensive doctrine. Command had rejected the proposal as tactically unsound and explicitly forbidden its implementation. Johnson had implemented it anyway, quietly, training his crew in unauthorized techniques during supposed routine patrols. 47 confirmed kills later, he'd proven the methodology worked. Command had responded by grounding his crew to prevent further violations of doctrine. The 18 Zeros approaching were about to force Command to choose between doctrine and results, because Johnson was taking off regardless of orders, and in approximately 20 minutes, he was going to provide undeniable evidence that his reckless modifications worked better than officially approved procedures. The Montana trapshooter, who understood lead. Robert Johnson grew up outside Billings, Montana, where his father ran a sporting clays course and taught trapshoot competition. By the time Johnson was 14, he was winning state-level trapshoot championships, which meant he'd developed an instinctive understanding of something most shooters struggled with: leading moving targets. Trap shooting required predicting where a clay disc would be in the fraction of a second between trigger pull and pellet arrival, then placing your shot pattern in that future position rather than where the target currently appeared. Good trap shooters learned to calculate lead subconsciously. Their brains processed target speed and angle, predicted future position, and directed their swing automatically. Elite trapshooters like Johnson's father could hit targets at extreme angles that required leading by 6 to 8 feet, placing shotgun patterns where targets would be rather than where they were. Johnson's father had taught him the fundamental principle: you don't shoot at the target, you shoot at where the target is going to be. That distinction seemed obvious, but most shooters never truly internalized it. They instinctively aimed at what they could see rather than where their projectiles needed to go. Johnson had internalized it completely by age 12, and by 16, he could consistently hit crossing targets that required 10-foot leads at 40-yard ranges. He brought that understanding to the Army Air Forces when he enlisted in 1941. During aerial gunnery training, instructors taught the standard methodology: track the target with your gun sight, estimate range and deflection, apply standard lead corrections from the manual, and fire. Johnson immediately recognized the methodology was backwards. It taught gunners to aim at where fighters were, then apply corrections to compensate for movement. His trapshoot training said you should aim directly at where fighters would be, making lead calculation primary rather than correctional. When he suggested teaching gunners to think like trapshooters rather than like manual following technicians, his instructor had dismissed the idea. Corporal, trapshoot is a sport. Aerial gunnery is combat. We use proven doctrinal procedures, not civilian hunting techniques. Johnson had filed that response away as another example of institutional blindness, preventing people from recognizing that the skills already existed. You just had to apply them correctly. The pattern that kept killing crews. The deaths started in earnest during the Guadalcanal campaign in late 1942. On the 14th of October, a formation of 8 B-17s encountered 24 Japanese Zeros during a bombing run on Rabaul. The bombers maintained tight formation, gunners firing according to doctrine, short, controlled bursts at fighters that entered their designated defensive zones. The formation shot down 6 Zeros through combined defensive fire. The Japanese shot down 3 B-17s and damaged 2 others so severely they barely made it back to base. 33 American aircrew died. The kill ratio was 2-to-1 in America's favor in terms of aircraft destroyed, but the exchange was unsustainable. Losing 3 heavy bombers with 10-man crews to kill 6 single-seat fighters represented a strategic defeat. On the 3rd of November, it happened again. 6 B-17s, 16 Zeros, tight formation defense, overlapping fire zones, 4 Zeros destroyed, 2 B-17s shot down, 1 more crashed attempting emergency landing. 23 Americans dead. The pattern was consistent. American bomber formations would shoot down Japanese fighters through sheer volume of defensive firepower, but the Zeros would exploit defensive gaps to kill bombers at rates that made every mission a calculated attrition exchange favoring Japan. By early December, Johnson's bomb group had lost 11 B-17s to fighter attacks in 8 weeks. He'd studied every after-action report, debriefed every surviving gunner, and identified the core problem. Doctrine assumed defensive zones would overlap sufficiently that no fighter could approach without being engaged. Reality showed that Zeros were maneuverable enough to exploit brief gaps in coverage. The 2-second window when a gunner was reloading, the 3-second period when a gunner tracked a different fighter, the 4-second interval when formation turbulence prevented accurate fire. Japanese pilots had learned to time their attacks for these predictable gaps, diving through defensive coverage during the brief moments when specific firing positions couldn't engage effectively. The solution seemed obvious to Johnson. Stop waiting for fighters to enter your defensive zone. Start engaging them during their approach when they were still maneuvering into attack position and couldn't maneuver as aggressively. Instead of waiting for a Zero to commit to its attack run and enter your optimal engagement envelope, shoot at it during the setup phase when it was still positioning, forcing it to abort early, or take fire during vulnerable maneuvering. The technique required gunners to shoot at much longer ranges with much larger lead corrections, essentially treating a 50 caliber machine gun like a shotgun on flying ducks, leading by ridiculous amounts and engaging targets at ranges where most gunners assumed they'd waste ammunition. But wasting ammunition that forced fighters to abort attacks was better than conserving ammunition while fighters killed your crew. Johnson started calculating the mathematics. If you could engage fighters at 600 yards during their approach instead of at 300 yards during their attack run, you gave them 4 additional seconds of exposure to defensive fire, and you forced them to either abort their approach or continue through sustained fire during their most vulnerable maneuvering. The trade-off was lower hit probability per round fired, but higher cumulative probability of disrupting attacks before they reached lethal range. The statistics were compelling. The AAF's defensive doctrine got 11 bombers shot down in 8 weeks. Johnson's proposed methodology might waste more ammunition, but it would save bombers. He just needed permission to prove it. When command said, absolutely not. On the 18th of December 1942, Johnson requested a meeting with Colonel James Bradford, his group commander. He brought detailed analysis of fighter attack patterns, calculations showing optimal engagement ranges for defensive gunnery, and a specific proposal: authorize his crew to experiment with extended-range predictive gunnery techniques during non-critical missions to test effectiveness. Bradford listened for perhaps 90 seconds before cutting him off. Captain, our defensive doctrine has been developed by the finest tactical minds in the Army Air Forces. validated through extensive testing, and proven in combat. What you're proposing, shooting at fighters at 600 yards when they're barely visible, is a waste of ammunition we can't afford to waste. Sir, the current doctrine has resulted in 11 bomber losses in 8 weeks. If we could reduce that by even 20%, we reduce losses by maintaining tight formation discipline and executing proper defensive procedures, Captain. Your proposal would have gunners burning through ammunition shooting at targets they can't hit effectively, leaving them low on ammunition when fighters close to optimal engagement range. Johnson tried a different approach. Sir, I've calculated that even with reduced hit probability at extended range, the cumulative effect of forcing fighters to abort approaches earlier. Captain, you're a pilot, not a tactical analyst. The experts who developed our defensive doctrine understand aerial combat better than you do. Your job is to fly your aircraft according to established procedures, not to reinvent bomber defense based on hunting techniques you learned in Montana. Bradford stood up. Your proposal is denied. You will continue following standard defensive doctrine. You will not experiment with unauthorized gunnery techniques. You will not waste ammunition shooting at targets beyond effective engagement range. Am I clear? Perfectly clear, sir. Good. Dismissed. Johnson saluted and left, already planning how he'd implement his methodology without Bradford's knowledge. The order was clear. Don't experiment with unauthorized techniques. Johnson decided that orders based on doctrine that killed crews were less important than techniques that saved them, even if following those orders was required for career advancement. Building the gunnery revolution. Johnson started training his crew 3 days later during what he reported as routine defensive gunnery practice. He began with his top turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Michael Chen from San Francisco, who'd grown up duck hunting in California wetlands and understood intuitively what Johnson was teaching. The fundamental technique was leading targets by absurd amounts. Standard doctrine taught gunners to lead fighters by roughly 50 feet at 300 yards, approximately 1 aircraft length. Johnson taught his gunners to lead by 150 feet at 600 yards, 3 aircraft lengths ahead of where the zero currently appeared. The visual was counterintuitive and felt wrong. You aimed at empty sky far ahead of the target, trusting mathematics and muscle memory rather than visual confirmation. They practiced by having Johnson fly the B-17 in formation with a cooperative P-38 fighter that simulated zero attack approaches. Chen would track the P-38 through his top turret sight, calculating impossible leads, firing at empty sky where the fighter would be in 2 seconds. The first week produced 0 hits. The second week produced occasional hits at extreme range. By the 4th week, Chen could consistently engage approaching fighters at ranges between 500 and 700 yards, forcing them to break off or take sustained fire during their approach maneuvers. The key innovation was treating aerial gunnery like wing shooting. Forget the fighter's current position, visualize its flight path, aim at the intersection of that path with your bullet stream 2 seconds in the future. Johnson drilled his entire crew on the technique. Top turret, ball turret, waist gunners, tail gunner. Each position learned optimal engagement ranges for different attack angles, practiced leading by amounts that felt absurdly excessive, and developed muscle memory for predictive shooting rather than reactive tracking. They also violated another doctrine principle: autonomous fire control. Standard procedure required the pilot or bombardier to coordinate defensive fire, directing gunners to specific threats, and managing ammunition conservation. Johnson gave every gunner autonomous authority to engage any target they identified, trusting their judgment and encouraging aggressive early engagement rather than waiting for coordination approval. By late January 1943, his crew could engage incoming fighters at ranges where most bomber crews never opened fire, forcing Zeros to maneuver defensively during their approaches rather than setting up optimal attack geometry. The technique burned through ammunition at roughly double the rate of standard defensive doctrine, but it forced fighters to abort attacks or accept sustained fire throughout their entire approach phase rather than just during the final attack run. On the 27th of January, they tested the methodology in actual combat for the first time, 600 yards to Vindication. The mission was a bombing run on Japanese positions at Manda Point. Johnson's B-17 was flying number 3 position in a 6-plane formation when 8 Zeros appeared at 10 o'clock high, 6,000 yards distant, beginning their approach for a coordinated attack on the formation. Standard doctrine called for gunners to track the approaching fighters visually, hold fire until they reached approximately 400 yards, then engage with controlled bursts as fighters entered optimal engagement range. Johnson's methodology called for engaging immediately at maximum visible range, firing at predicted intercept points rather than current positions. Staff Sergeant Chen in the top turret opened fire at 620 yards, leading the nearest Zero by approximately 160 feet, aiming at empty sky well ahead of where the fighter currently appeared. The first burst missed. The second burst hit. Tracer rounds walking across the Zero's left wing. The Japanese pilot immediately broke off his approach, diving away from the sustained fire he wasn't expecting at that range. The other gunners followed Chen's example, engaging all 8 Zeros during their approach phase rather than waiting for them to commit to attack runs. The volume of fire wasn't overwhelming. Individual bursts from different positions rather than concentrated salvos. But the psychological effect on the Japanese pilots was significant. They were taking fire 600 yards out instead of 400 yards out during the phase where they were maneuvering into position rather than committed to an attack vector. 3 Zeros aborted their approaches immediately. 2 more took hits during their setup maneuvers and broke off damaged. The remaining 3 Zeros pressed their attacks, but they'd been forced to maneuver defensively during their approaches, ruining their attack geometry. All 3 missed with their initial attacks, and Johnson's gunners destroyed 1 during its breakaway. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 45 seconds. Johnson's B-17 sustained 0 damage. The formation as a whole shot down 3 Zeros and damaged 2 more, while losing 0 bombers. Traditional defensive doctrine would have waited for the Zeros to close to 400 yards, engaged during their attack runs, probably shot down 1 or 2 fighters, and likely lost at least 1 bomber to the coordinated attack. Johnson's methodology had engaged at 600 yards, disrupted the attack formation during the approach phase, prevented any effective attacks from being executed, and achieved superior results while expending roughly twice the ammunition. The after-action report was interesting. Johnson reported, standard defensive procedures, aggressive gunnery by well-trained crew, favorable engagement results. He didn't mention engaging at unauthorized ranges, didn't explain the predictive leading technique, didn't acknowledge violating doctrine. The formation commander noted, exceptional defensive effectiveness by Johnson's aircraft, recommend crew commendation for superior gunnery. Command commended the crew. Command had no idea the crew had achieved those results by ignoring doctrine completely. The method that spread through crews. Word spread through the bomber groups on Guadalcanal within 2 weeks, carried by gunners who'd watched Johnson's crew engage fighters at ranges where most crews never fired. By mid-February, 3 other B-17 crews were quietly practicing the extended-range predictive gunnery techniques, learning from Johnson during informal training sessions that officially never happened. On the 19th of February, Captain Thomas Webb's crew used the methodology to destroy 4 Zeros during a single engagement, forcing a dozen other Japanese fighters to abort their attacks without achieving any hits on the bomber formation. On the 27th of February, Lieutenant Marcus Chen's waist gunner killed a Zero at estimated 640 yards, a shot that wouldn't have been attempted under standard doctrine. By mid-March, roughly 15 B-17 crews across 2 bomb groups were using variations of Johnson's predictive gunnery methodology. The statistical impact was dramatic and impossible to ignore. In January, before the technique spread, the bomb groups lost 9 B-17 to fighter attacks across 42 missions, a loss rate of 21%. In February and March, after the methodology became widespread, the groups lost 3 B-17S across 57 missions, a loss rate of 5%. Fighter kill claims increased from an average of 0.37 fighters destroyed per bomber mission to 1.2 fighters destroyed per mission. The Japanese noticed. Intelligence reports captured later showed Japanese pilots complaining that American bomber defensive fire had inexplicably increased in range and accuracy, and that approaches that had previously been safe were now resulting in defensive fire at distances where accurate gunnery should be impossible. Command noticed too, but for the wrong reasons. In early April, Major General Nathan Twining visited Guadalcanal to investigate reports of unauthorized tactical modifications being implemented by bomber crews. Someone, Johnson never learned who, had informed command that crews were violating defensive doctrine through unauthorized gunnery techniques and excessive ammunition expenditure. On the 6th of April, Twining grounded Johnson's crew pending investigation and issued explicit orders: return to standard defensive procedures immediately, cease unauthorized training, and stop encouraging other crews to violate established doctrine. Johnson decided that order was less important than the Japanese fighters that would be attacking Henderson Field the next morning. 18 zeros and a career-ending decision. The warning came at 0830 on the 7th of April. 18 Japanese Zeros inbound to Henderson Field. Estimated arrival 0945. Mission apparently to strafe parked aircraft and destroy bombers on the ground. Every available fighter had been scrambled to intercept, but the P-38s and P-40s wouldn't reach the Zeros before they began their strafing runs. Johnson looked at his grounded B-17, looked at the approaching threat, and made his decision. He gathered his crew at 0915 and explained the situation clearly. They'd been explicitly ordered not to fly. Taking off meant disobeying direct orders from a major general, and they'd likely face court-martial afterward. But 18 Zeros were about to strafe the field, and a B-17 in the air with 10 50 caliber machine guns could engage them using the predictive gunnery methodology they'd perfected over 3 months. Every crew member volunteered immediately. They were airborne at 0935, climbing to 8,000 feet directly above Henderson Field. The Zeros arrived at 0943 as predicted, beginning their descent toward the parked aircraft below. They spotted Johnson's lone B-17 immediately, a single bomber without formation support, apparently a perfect target. 8 Zeros broke off from the strafing run to engage the isolated bomber. Johnson maintained straight and level flight, giving his gunners optimal firing positions. The Zeros approached from various angles. High, low beam attacks, expecting to overwhelm the single bomber's defensive fire through coordinated multi-axis attacks. Johnson's crew engaged at 600 yards, every gunner firing at predicted intercept points rather than current fighter positions. The volume of fire was extraordinary. 10 50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously at different targets, all engaging during the fighter's approach phase rather than waiting for committed attack runs. The first Zero took hits at 580 yards and immediately broke off, trailing smoke. The second absorbed sustained fire throughout its approach and exploded at 400 yards. The third and fourth aborted their attacks after taking hits during their setup maneuvers. The fifth pressed its attack and got destroyed at 300 yards by converging fire from 3 different gun positions. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. The remaining Zeros made repeated attack runs. Johnson's crew engaged each approach at extended range, and Japanese pilots kept dying or aborting during the phase where they expected to be safe from effective defensive fire. By the time the Zeros broke off and withdrew, Johnson's crew had destroyed 8 confirmed kills, with 3 more probable, while sustaining minor damage to the B-17's wing and tail surfaces. Johnson landed at 0952. Major General Twining was waiting on the runway, along with Colonel Bradford and several other senior officers. Johnson was either about to be court-martialed or commended. He genuinely wasn't sure which. Questions with obvious answers. Twining walked directly to Johnson as he climbed out of the aircraft. "Captain, I explicitly ordered your crew grounded. You took off anyway, in direct violation of a general officer's command." "Yes, sir. 18 enemy fighters were attacking this field. I assessed that engaging them took priority over remaining grounded." "That's not your decision to make, Captain. I gave you a direct order." "Yes, sir. I chose to disobey it." Twining stared at him for a long moment, then looked at the 8 destroyed Zeros burning in the jungle beyond the airfield perimeter. "Your crew just shot down 8 enemy fighters in 9 minutes, from a single bomber without formation support, using techniques I specifically ordered you to stop teaching." "Yes, sir. Those techniques waste ammunition, violate defensive doctrine, and represent a complete abandonment of proper bomber defense procedures." "Yes, sir. They also reduced our monthly bomber loss rate from 21% to 5% and increased fighter kills per mission by 300%. Bradford intervened. "General, I've reviewed the statistics. Every crew using Captain Johnson's gunnery methodology has achieved superior defensive results. Our losses to fighter attacks have dropped dramatically since these techniques spread through the group. Twining looked at the burning zeros again, then back at Johnson. Captain, you understand I should court-martial you for disobeying a direct order from a general officer? Yes, sir. I understand completely. However, I'm not going to do that, because court-martialing you would require me to officially acknowledge that AAF defensive doctrine was inadequate, and that a captain with trapshoot experience developed better procedures than our tactical experts. Twining paused. Instead, I'm promoting you to Major and assigning you to 5th Air Force Headquarters as Senior Bomber Defense Advisor. Your official job will be reviewing defensive procedures. Your actual job will be teaching every bomber crew in the Pacific your unauthorized techniques, while we very slowly and quietly revise official doctrine to match what you've already proven works. And the court-martial for disobeying orders, sir? There will be no court-martial. There will be no official acknowledgement that you were ever grounded. There will be no documentation of this conversation, but there will be a lot of bomber crews who don't die because someone was willing to ignore stupid orders. Twining turned to Bradford. Colonel, I want every bomber crew in this theater trained in extended range predictive gunnery within 3 months. We'll call it Advanced Defensive Procedures and pretend it was developed through official channels rather than by a Montana trapshooter who understood lead correction better than our doctrine writers. Johnson saluted. He disobeyed a direct order, violated doctrine, proven his methodology worked, and gotten promoted for it. The system had decided results mattered more than obedience, which was exactly what he'd gambled on. The Montana trapshooters' legacy. Robert Johnson trained 647 bomber crews in predictive gunnery methodology over the next 18 months, traveling across the Pacific Theater, teaching gunners to shoot like trapshooters rather than like manual-following technicians. He never wrote an official manual, never published formal doctrine, never created training materials that acknowledged the techniques contradicted pre-war defensive procedures. By September 1944, extended-range predictive gunnery had become standard practice across Pacific bomber operations. Bomber loss rates to fighter attacks dropped from an average of 18% in early 1943 to 4% by mid-1944. Fighter kill claims per bomber mission increased from 0.37 to 1.6. The statistical transformation was complete. American bombers had gone from vulnerable targets to lethal fighter killers, all because gunners learned to lead moving targets like wing shooters rather than wait for fighters to enter optimal attack range. Johnson's personal crew, the team that had developed and validated the original methodology, achieved the highest defensive effectiveness statistics in the Pacific Theater. 98 confirmed 0 kills over 6 months of operations, with 0 losses to fighter attack across 63 combat missions. That 9-8-0 record made them statistically the most lethal bomber crew in the theater, despite officially not being designated a fighter-killing crew. The Army Air Forces officially incorporated advanced predictive gunnery procedures into bomber defense doctrine in 1951, 8 years after Johnson had proven they worked. The official documentation credited operational experience and systematic tactical development, with no mention of Johnson or his crew. Johnson retired as a colonel in 1958, returned to Montana, and ran his father's sporting clays course until 1989. He died in 1995 at age 76, having spent 42 years teaching trapshoot and 16 years in the Air Force. The Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson has a small exhibit on Pacific bomber operations that mentions improved defensive gunnery in 1943 and 44, but doesn't identify Johnson or explain that the improvements came from unauthorized techniques developed in violation of official doctrine. The real lesson wasn't about gunnery or bombers or aerial combat. It was about recognizing when civilian skills directly solved military problems and having the courage to implement solutions even when doctrine said they were wrong. Johnson understood something the AAF's tactical experts initially missed, that leading moving targets was identical, whether you were shooting clay discs with shotguns or Japanese fighters with .50 calibers, and that the skills already existed in gunners who'd grown up hunting. You just had to teach them to apply trapshoot techniques instead of manual procedures. He'd grown up shooting clays that required 10-foot leads at 40 yards, learning that you aimed at where targets would be rather than where they were. He'd approached aerial gunnery the same way. Ignore where the fighter currently is, visualize where it will be when your bullets arrive, and put your fire there through prediction rather than tracking. The fact that the AAF took 8 years to officially acknowledge what he'd proven in 9 minutes of combat said more about institutions than it did about innovation. He went back to Montana after all that, taught trapshoot to the same hunters and sportsmen his father had taught, and occasionally mentioned to students that the techniques they were learning had once shot down 98 Japanese fighters when someone decided rules mattered less than results. The scores are still posted at the Billings Sportsman's Club. Robert Johnson, Montana State Trapshoot Champion 1939, 1940, and 1959. No mention of the 98 zeros. No mention of the grounding order he violated. No mention of how many bomber crews survived because a trapshooter understood lead correction better than the experts who wrote the manuals. Sometimes the best military innovation comes from people who learned to shoot birds in Montana and recognized that fighters were just faster, more dangerous birds that required bigger leads and more commitment. Johnson proved it. Command eventually accepted it. The crews who didn't die because of it never knew his name.